Funding for the art show was made possible by Montgomery County Arts and Cultural District and viewers like you. Thank you.
In this edition of the art show, an illustrator brings life to comics.
Got one particular rejection letter, and he said, if you're ever going to work in mainstream comics, you have to draw people pretty.
One man showcases the versatility of the banjo.
So I used the old mountain tunings and the modern bluegrass picking style, and it opened up a whole new world.
And a photographer invites us to reflect on a controversial past.
I think Becker's art wants to give us a different experience of the Holocaust, or give us a different way to think about it.
It's all ahead on this edition of the art show. Hello, I'm Rodney Veal, and this is The Art Show, bringing you local, regional, and national art profiles each week. Bruce Hughes has been writing, drawing, and selling original comics in local shops and at numerous conventions since 1996. His occasional need for sleep is the only thing that hampers his passion for comics.
I started reading comics because my parents traveled a lot on the weekends. Back then you could buy comic books at gas stations and drugstores. So my parents would drop $5 and keep me quiet for the 4-hour trip. And then I thought, I can do this, right?
This is Bruce O. Hughes. He lives in Germantown. He's a comic book illustrator, and in his own words, very nerdy.
This forces you to become nerdy. I know guys who make their own brushes to ink with, and if they'd never been artists, they would have never known that skill. A lot of guys I know who do this are amazing at math, because they have to figure out perspectives and how to break things down. And there are random words that I know because I've used them in script, like psychopomp. That was someone's profession. They would help people feel better about death, and they would hold your hand while you died. I would have never known that if I hadn't written a horrible story about some aliens. So I think it makes you nerdy.
A graduate of the School of Advertising Art in Kettering, Bruce worked for several companies doing illustrations before deciding to take his talents to the comic book industry.
I remember my first comic book convention, going in and seeing the artist, and I thought, this guy's not any better than me. I could do that. So then me and a couple of my buddies, we started putting together our own comics, got a lot of rejection letters, got one particular rejection letter I still have from an editor named Dan Raspler. And he said, if you're ever going to work in mainstream comics, you have to draw people pretty. Oh yeah, old man, I'll show you. I'll draw the ugliest people you've ever seen. And while that ruined me from superhero comics, I think I became a better artist, because I didn't worry about making people symmetrical or giving them perfect teeth or noses or anything like that.
Many comic book illustrators work as part of a team, like Brian Latimer of Sydney.
Typically there's a writer, an artist of some sort, and a colorist, and then also a letterer who does the actual dialogue and copy on the pages. My job typically is what they call a penciler and inker. The writer gives it the structure. I take that and I sort out what the characters are doing as far as the details and the acting. I will figure out all the camera shots, angles, and then send it off to the writer, double check, make sure it's good for him or her, and send it on to the next person in the line into production.
Indie artists, like Bruce, tend to be a one-man band. The more independent an artist is in the comic world, the more the artist is doing all aspects of the production himself, including the writing, the inking, the coloring, and the printing.
Since I do everything myself, I usually start with an idea, and then I'm like, okay, I need a couple thousand more ideas to put around this. So I come up with plot points. I say, okay, these are the 400 things I want done in the comic. And then I break those down into scenes, how many pages it's going to take, and then I break it down page by page. The thumbnail's where it starts. It's very critical to figure out how many panels you're going to have, the angles of everything. If you have a bad thumbnail, then you're cursed from the beginning. And that's the really small version of everything. After that comes the penciling. I do a lot of digital pencils nowadays. It saves me on paper and ink. You take the pencil, put it on a light table, let it shine through, and I can ink that. After you ink either traditional or digital, you need to get it into Photoshop to color. So I scan that in, lay down flat tones first. You decide, okay, so the background and the foreground, I need to separate them totally. This will be dark, this will be light, things like that. And then you go in and you start layering texture. Then I letter it. So I take it into Illustrator usually, because you want your letters to be nice and crisp. And then I'll get some color proofs, and then I'll save up the money to get it actually printed.
Comic books have evolved since their introduction in the early 1930s. They were originally used as advertising giveaway premiums. They then turned to war and crime themes for soldiers stationed abroad in World War II. And then in the 1950s, they were blamed for juvenile delinquency.
I think most people, when they think comics, they think of comics in the 60s. They think of kids buying Superman, buying Batman, and it really has changed. I think the change really began in the 90s. You saw it shift largely from kids to teens and then to older readers. Now I think there's something more of a respect for it as an art form, or just as more of a viable entertainment medium, and that has definitely helped it.
There's definitely the stereotype that comics are strictly superheroes, which is not the case at all. In fact, in independent comics, it's more often not superheroes. There's plenty of superheroes, but a lot of times in the indie comics, it's a different take on them than you would get from your standard Marvel and DC. Like the comic I'm working on right now is a Western. I mean, it's not superhero at all.
My granny is 87 years old, and I got her to read Hellboy comics because she was curious. I found a Hellboy comic about when he was first summoned during World War II, and this flashback to one of his ancestors, and she read it and liked it and references it all the time. I will say, today there are more genres out there than ever before. So I think if you find the right comic for anybody, it'll change their opinion instantly.
Even with the wide range of comic book options, the audience is still largely male, between the ages of 24 to 40.
As far as the actual industry as a whole, I would say that, yeah, it's absolutely grown up. It's stories for adults, stories for kids, stories for everybody in between. We're kind of the, to put it politely, the little brother industry as far as like relative to TV and film. With that growing up phase, it's getting a lot more respect from other industries to realize that, yes, this is a valid medium for storytelling, and it's not something that's just kids stuff anymore. So they're really seeing it as a storytelling potential rather than something to be laughed at.
The production quality is a lot higher. I mean, if you look back at the first issue of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, that was really rough. I mean, they were hand lettering. The art wasn't scanned in that clearly. Things were a muddy mess. And then late 80s, early 90s, people started doing things more digital. Just the coloring and the lettering got so much better.
In the comic book world, there's one day a week that is met with great anticipation.
Wednesday is always the biggest day for us as far as comic sales go. All the new books are released every Wednesday of the week.
There will be people sneaking in at lunch all the time, and you'll see the craziest assortment of people.
We typically put the books out the night before, and people come in and pick them out throughout the day.
There are people in three-piece suits who go in and buy comics right next to, the guy who's mopping the floor next door. Mavericks is a good shop. Mavericks is nice to the little guys like me because they do sell my comics there. I think that's one of the big things that keeps the independents where they are, is there's no way for me to get my comics into all the shops across America without going through some sort of big retail chain, and that would cost me so much upfront money.
In general, I'm a big advocate for buying local and that sort of thing, and Ohio has probably a good 100 or so creators just in Ohio doing their thing, making their books and trying to get out there to conventions and sell. I am very active on Facebook. What I like to do is to just post up works in progress, have conversations with other folks, and just educate folks that don't really know the behind the scenes part of it.
People are still making a living doing this. I have original comic book art I've paid hundreds of dollars for hanging up on the walls. I got a Spider-Man page down there that could one day buy my son his first car. I don't know if people respect it, though. I tell somebody what I do, and they're like, "Oh, you make cartoons." Cartoons like Garfield or BC Wizard of Id. That's a cartoon. I have to know more about anatomy and more storytelling than just 3-panel setup for a punchline. So it's not respected as an art form, but it has the value of an art form.
Log on to BruceO'Hughes.com to see more of his work, read his blog, or purchase his work. Follow Brian Latimer on Twitter or like him on Facebook. The bluegrass tradition is one that has existed in American Appalachia for generations. Thanks to musicians like Tony Ellis, we now find this unique music all over the world and being pushed to new heights.
When I lived in Tennessee, I had musicians that I played with that were good friends, and we played different things. But when I came to Ohio, I had no one to play with. I didn't know any musicians. And so I would sit at the kitchen table with the coffee pot and my banjo, thinking about my buddies back in Tennessee. I missed playing music with them. And also thinking about the years with my grandmother and things that she had taught me. So I was thinking about these old tunings that Granny used on the banjo, and I started experimenting and writing new melodies in these old tunings. So I used the old mountain tunings and the modern bluegrass picking style, and it opened up a whole new world of opportunity to write new melodies that were quite different in many ways. Instead of everything being fast and furious and exciting, you could write music that was quiet and peaceful and beautiful, and things that like lullabies that you just didn't do that on a 5-string banjo. Moving to Ohio really did open up a whole new world for me in the banjo.
Tony Ellis is totally wide open to new implications, to new orchestrations, to new ways to think about music, to bring new material into his singing, to perform with other instruments, to perform for new audiences. He's drawn to, his particular knack is taking traditional fiddle and banjo music where it's never been before and bringing new material, both from the world and from his own soul, into those instruments. He breathes new life into the tradition.
I've been best described as playing music that's called Americana. It represents early elements of the banjo and Appalachian life and musical life in America, and goes right up to modern times, so that it incorporates lots of different elements of American history in terms of the banjo, musical history.
Originally self-taught, Tony took banjo lessons and honed his skills, eventually auditioning for the father of bluegrass, Bill Monroe. He later spent 2.5 years as part of his legendary Bluegrass Boys.
It was a grueling experience in many ways, but an absolutely marvelous experience in many ways. As an answer to a young fellow's dreams, to get to play with one of the grand masters of bluegrass music, and actually the man that was credited with having created bluegrass music.
In the country, people either play the banjo or the fiddle. It's very rare to find a musician that can master both. And that's another thing that makes Tony both interesting and youthful.
The thing about Tony, the way he impressed me and influenced me, was that he plays banjo that's totally different from anything I've ever heard. And it's still really lovely to listen to.
Playing a banjo has lots of elements in it, lots of things that are exciting and wonderful. And I love to play with a good bluegrass band because the fire is there, the rhythm there, the guitar, you're playing off of other musicians, and it all just creates an excitement and an electricity and a great deal of fun.
Tony is an interesting traditional musician in that he is fully rooted in what has come before him, in the way other people have played, in the classical ways of approaching repertoire and performance. But what sets Tony apart is his personal interpretation of those skills, of those styles. He's also been an ambassador out since his retirement from his business career. Tony's been called upon to take his music, his banjo, his fiddle, around the United States and around the world.
Where does an old-time engineer go after he's cooled her down? Bluegrass music in Ohio is very similar to bluegrass music in Tennessee and bluegrass music all over the world. We were in Japan, and a Japanese bluegrass band sounded like Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs. It just blew my mind. Wonderful players, and it's like that in Yugoslavia and Germany. Everywhere we travel, we run into musicians that play bluegrass music, and they do it well. When we play in foreign countries, we try to give them a real down-home sampling of Appalachian music from America.
Through his performances, Tony reaches a worldwide audience. But he also remembers his roots and how important it is to keep traditional music alive locally with concerts on his farm.
We try to encourage the continuation of traditional American music here in Ohio, and in particular using Ohio musicians. And we've had some excellent programs here at the farm. We've had a continuing series of programs. We'll have 3, maybe 4 concerts a year. We have a pavilion down here, and we've had some great programs. We really try to keep that alive and well and in the forefront of local entertainment in Pickaway County. To draw the community into traditional music is something we strive to do because it represents the roots of people that live here. And many people really do care about their grandparents' music, their parents' music, and even going further back, and historic Ohio music, songs that talk about the history of Ohio or represent the history of Ohio.
Like the wise sages from the mountains, you get the sense that Tony's thought a lot before he speaks, and that there's a lot of wisdom in what he says, and that it would be useful to you, it would be valuable to listen when Tony speaks. Now that's true both when he speaks with his voice and when he speaks with his instrument.
You don't make any money, it's a labor of love. You hope that you've made a contribution musically that will last. It's something that people like well enough and care enough about that it won't be lost 5 years from now or 10 years from now, maybe 25, 50 years from now. One of your tunes may still be out there being played by someone and enjoyed by someone. So you hope that you've made a lasting contribution of quality that people will enjoy and appreciate.
Check out DaytonStringInstruments.com if you're interested in learning more about the Dayton banjo, one of several string instruments manufactured on Apple Street until 1940 by Charles B. Rausch.
Are you an artist or know an artist with an interesting story? Pitch it to us. Send an email to theartshow@thinktv.org. Include contact information and links to performances or art samples online.
Austrian artist Heinrich Bacher dedicated his life to documenting the remnants of Nazism and the Holocaust. His unique perspective, complicated by his participation in the Hitler Youth movement as a teenager, provides a distinctive lens into this dark and tragic period.
I think it's important for a contemporary art museum to not just show art that is made recently, but to show art that deals with issues that are contemporary.
We think we know what the Holocaust is, but I think for most people the Holocaust is a closed chapter in history, one that we've dealt with and that we can now move on from. Heinrich Becker was an Austrian artist. He was born in 1925 and died in 2003. He first came to prominence in the 1960s and 1970s as the editor of an avant-garde journal called Neue Texte, or New Texts, and he focused on concrete poetry. Concrete poetry is a kind of poetry that emphasizes how the word and how the letter looks on the page. As he was working on this journal, he also began to reflect on his own past as a member of the Hitler Youth and as a member of the Nazi Party. He never participated in any activities in which anyone would have been hurt, but he never denied the fact that he was an enthusiastic supporter of the Nazis.
There are a very small number of artists who dedicate their entire lives to a single project. And that's actually what Heinrich Becker did. He saw this as an enterprise that will never be complete, or is only completed when he dies.
The exhibition is called Landscape M, and Landscape M stands for the landscape of Mauthausen. And Mauthausen was the largest concentration camp in Austria. It was also an industrial site where slave labor was performed by the inmates. They worked in quarries where they were often worked to death. And beginning in 1968, Becker made hundreds of trips there as a photographer. So as Becker photographed the camps, he began to realize that there were actually still a lot of material there. And so he began to collect objects, which he called finds or found objects. And for Becker, it was a way of saving these objects before they disappeared. The exhibition also includes the photographs that he took in the 90s of his television screen. And these pictures from the television screen are arranged like many of his photos in small series of 3 or 4 images, and they look almost like a contact sheet. The exhibition also includes a multi-panel visual work of concrete poetry, and he wrote it using quotations from a Nazi submarine logbook. And these quotations record location, wind, sea condition, weather, and there's just one page where something else happens. How the submarine comes upon a lifeboat and they let them go on the lifeboat nonetheless. So Becker was always a poet and a photographer at the same time. You can see in his poetry he's thinking visually, and in his photographs he's thinking textually. I think for Becker, art should invite us to reflect and also criticize.
I thought that it was especially important to do an exhibition like this, which doesn't sensationalize, which doesn't attempt to manipulate you, but somehow still makes it so clear that this is an enormously important matter for you to pay attention to.
I think Becker's art wants to give us a different experience of the Holocaust, or give us a different way to think about it. Not as this abstract chapter in history, but as a collection of millions of moments of suffering and cruelty. And I think he wants to show us this by emphasizing the details. Becker was extraordinary not for being a Nazi Party member, but for dedicating the rest of his life to reflecting on that experience and that history in a very public way.
The Dayton Holocaust Resource Center is responsible for storing, maintaining, purchasing, and disseminating Holocaust educational materials for teachers and researchers in the greater Dayton area. Visit DaytonHolocaust.org for details. You can see their permanent exhibit at the National Museum of the United States Air Force.
To view any of tonight's stories again or watch an episode in its entirety, watch The Art Show on demand at thinktv.org/The Art Show. You'll also find bonus features and extended interviews on select artists.
And that wraps it up for this edition of the Art Show. The Miami Valley has a really vibrant and lively arts community. Be sure to get out there and be a part of it. Until next time, I'm Rodney Veal, and thanks for watching.
Funding for the Art Show was made possible by Montgomery County Arts and Cultural District, Ohio Arts Council, Ohio Humanities Council, and viewers like you. Thank you.